Yesterday, Mia O'Brien sent the 49ers community into a frenzy with this tweet right here. And it all started with that tweet from a guy named Pretty Ricky. And it's already been dismissed. And, people are like, it's just whatever. But boy, oh boy, Mia joined Bonte and Joe Shasky on the morning roast and revealed all the information that she has that got her to tweet this. And you are going to be absolutely floored by the amount of information she drops about this situation. As you can see right here, she tweeted under this tweet, Aiyuk interest is mutual between the Jaguars and his team per source, meaning Aiyuk and Aiyuk's representation has mutual interest with the Jaguars. And she is a Jaguars insider, and she dropped nugget after nugget. You are going to want to listen to this because she gives legitimate, real information and peels back the curtain behind the scenes of how this is playing out. Obviously, in a tweet, you're like, well, what the underneath this? Like, what? I get the speculation early on, but you need to listen to what Mia has to say. Take a listen as she joined 95.7 The Game this morning to explain all the information behind this tweet. And let me tell you, there's a lot of it. I got multiple points that we are going to have to break down after she gets done talking. Take a listen right here.
Can't reveal where your sources are, but why is there interest between Aiyuk and the Jaguars out of all teams?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of connect the dots, and I can kind of, for as much information and transparency as he can give you guys, I will, because, again, this is still very early in this process from what I've been told, but let's start connecting some dots. So yesterday, I was leaving wonderful TPC Sawgrass. The Players' Championship, of course, is this week here in Ponte Vedra Beach. Was headed to the Jaguars free agency press conference, received a call from someone within the Jaguars organization that, among other things, there were calls being placed and there was mutual interest between Brandon Aiyuk's camp and the Jacksonville Jaguars. One of those things that I get a lot of that during the week, and so I kind of just store those nuggets away. I then arrived at the stadium and saw, which I'm sure you guys have been following this account too, and if you have not, I'm sure you and your listeners will after this, that Pretty Ricky Twitter account that a lot of folks believe is actually someone involved with Athletes First, which of course is the agency that represents Brandon Aiyuk, that also represents Calvin Ridley. Let's table that for here in just a second as we continue to connect the dots. And so when I saw this Pretty Ricky account also tweet out about potential interest between Aiyuk and the Jacksonville Jaguars, I made a few more calls, and it was confirmed to me that Trent Baalke is indeed, after losing out on the Calvin Ridley sweepstakes and the rights to retain him here in Jacksonville, have been placing some calls about a potential replacement, adding another wide receiver to this wide receiver room. And so when you connect the dots, I mean, it isn't that hard to see. Calvin Ridley's representation is the same representation as Brandon Aiyuk. Even if it's a large, massive entity, you can't help but say, hey, there seems to be an indicator that in those negotiations that fell apart because ultimately Ridley signed with Tennessee, could there have been also, we may be shopping Brandon at some point or may be interested in finding a new home for him. Would there be interest? To which the Jaguars reciprocated it and said, yes, there would be interest on our part of it. Now, what would a deal look like? Is it actually happening? Again, way too early, although these things do happen rather quickly. I don't expect it gaining a ton of legs just because obviously Trent Baalke was a bit tied up yesterday with the Eric Armstead deal, needless to say. But I do think it's a situation worth monitoring because at the very least it suggests that, number one, Brandon Aiyuk's representation, if only to raise his leverage and raise his asking price for an eventual second contract, is shopping him around the league. And secondly, because the Jacksonville Jaguars are pushing all their chips in the middle of the table and could be looking to add that number one wide receiver that they thought they had in Calvin Ridley, but now perhaps don't have in the building.
Wow. You are a phenomenal reporter because you are giving us nothing but fact after fact after fact. So not knowing the framework of this, how aggressive is Jacksonville looking at this wide receiver market? Obviously, you referenced losing Calvin Ridley. Do you think they would be willing to give up a current first-round pick, or has it not even, you don't even know where the package would start with?
I would think the asking price, again, and this is from what I have been told, this is from Aiyuk's camp. So I don't think this is to say at all. Let's get that out there. This is not to say the San Francisco 49ers are shopping Brandon Aiyuk. I think in my opinion, I just think this is his representation, seeing what interest may be and seeing what an asking price and what an eventual contract might look like from a team. That's solely what I believe this is for. I believe if the 49ers were to be told that Aiyuk wanted a trade, they would look for nothing more than a first. I don't believe the Jaguars would part with their first-round pick. We've been workshopping some ideas here in Jacksonville about what compensation may look like, knowing he obviously is going into a contract year. Anywhere between a second this year, a third next year is something I know we've just talked about just as a radio station about what a deal could possibly look like, because as much as it's great to say, well, we still need wide receivers for Trevor Lawrence, you also still needed help on the interior of the defensive line. You still have an aging offensive line, and so there's still other holes you need to address with that 17th overall pick that I don't think can just be dismissed because you're getting a bona fide number one wide receiver entering the prime of his career. And so that's where I don't see a world in which the Jags would part with that first-round pick. But I do think that actually, in a weird twist of fate, signing Eric Armstead yesterday does free up a big need for the Jaguars that I thought they would address at 17th overall along the interior of that defensive line.
Wow, Mia O'Brien just on absolute fire here on the Morning Rush on 95.7 The Game. Do you think, Mia, they would be willing to give Brandon Aiyuk $50 million guaranteed, knowing he's only 25 years old, if the Jaguars did trade for the 49ers wide receiver?
Yeah, and that's actually something I was just talking with one of my colleagues here at the course about, because the truth of the matter is, again, for context sake, for everybody in the Bay Area, Calvin Ridley is 29 years old. He's soon to be 30 years old. His football shelf life is different than a lot of folks because he didn't leave high school until he was 19 years old, I believe. He didn't leave college until he was 22 years old. He obviously missed a year and a half due to the suspension and the medical leave of absence when he was with the Falcons. And so you could make the argument that his quote-unquote football life, he's really about 26 years old. And so if the Jags weren't willing to give him $50 million, would they be willing to give it to Brandon Aiyuk? I tend to believe that if in that 1 year, let's say the Jags were to somehow make a deal, and again, for all intents and purposes, this is a very much exploratory stages of a potential trade. But if they were to make a deal, I would be very curious if they had to agree to that extension before the trade was made, or if he would play on the fifth-year option, and then they would come up with the dollars and cents. I think just because the Jaguars have gambled on a Christian Kirk before, and they've seen amazing returns. But then last year with the Ridley deal, you eventually give up a third and a fifth-round pick, but for what proved to be a one-year rental. And so I'm curious if there would be a buyer beware of we need to see it in our building before we give that money. I would think Aiyuk, though, would command something in that $50 million guaranteed range if he's to continue the success he had on the field this past offseason.
Now, first of all, she addresses this Pretty Ricky guy. The conspiracy theory, the tinfoil hat theory, is that he works for Athletes First, which is one of the biggest representations of NFL athletes in the league. And again, of course, would have source information for all of this stuff, which is why he keeps hitting. He hit again today. Tyron Smith just signed with the New York Jets. This guy had it. This guy keeps hitting. He keeps hitting on these things. She believes that he is a part of that agency. So that agency happens to represent Brandon Aiyuk. Now, he is saying here he's not hearing anything about Brandon Aiyuk, but she opened up Pandora's box when it comes to connecting the dots between Athletes First and the Jags. And we have to go piece by piece. It is very rare that I pull out a notebook to write down all the individual points to go through something that someone says like this. Normally there's one or two points, we react to it, we move on. This is very interesting. She says someone from the Jaguars organization called her and told her that there was mutual interest between the Jags and Brandon Aiyuk's team. Again, when we say Brandon Aiyuk's team, we're saying Athletes First, his representation. So this is coming from a source inside the Jags organization. She then confirms that Trent Baalke is making calls on wide receivers to be traded. Again, citing the success in which they had for getting Christian Kirk. They traded for Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley signs a massive contract with the Tennessee Titans, in which she also confirms Baalke was trying to re-sign him, and they lost that battle, which means Baalke is pivoting to try to find another bona fide wide receiver one. Well, Brandon Aiyuk and Calvin Ridley have the same representation. They are both repped by athletes first. And so her theory is that in those negotiations, as they started to go sideways, as it started to appear that Ridley was going to leave and go to the Titans, they said, well, we have another player who might have some interest in potentially coming or being traded to the Jags. And the way she phrases it and frames it is that the reps ask Baalke and his team, would you be interested in that? And in response, Baalke and his team say, yes, we're very interested in Brandon Aiyuk. And the strategy behind this from athletes first, that, well, first of all, their number one goal is to get their clients paid. That's it. Paid and in a good situation. That's what they want. They want, their number one goal is to get the best for the player, best for Brandon Aiyuk. So if you are gauging interest from other teams who have legitimate interest in trading for Brandon Aiyuk, there is a way to raise leverage by the potential of getting contract offers from other teams who could potentially trade for him, which you can then take to the 49ers, for example, and allow to match. And again, that's all hypothetical based on the sense that Brandon Aiyuk is allowed to seek a trade and is allowed to have those conversations. I don't know anything about tampering the red tape with that. I mean, it sounds a little sketch for a rep to be like, well, sorry you didn't get Calvin Ridley. However, we got Brandon Aiyuk over here. He's younger. Huh? So, and the point being is that she has confirmed by one individual source that she doesn't say is Baalke, and then directly confirms that Baalke is interested in wide receivers. One confirms Aiyuk, Baalke's looking and calling on wide receivers. Connect the dots, they're calling on Brandon Aiyuk, potentially. Or that's what we're gathering from this information. So then the next conversation that happens after that is, well, what's the trade compensation? Is it going to be number 17 overall? Are they going to trade the first? You know, the Jags just signed Eric Armstead. She talks about how that was a huge need for them to be able to go interior defensive tackle potentially. And so they plug that hole with the addition of Eric Armstead. Would they be willing to give up the first? Or this is something that I've thought up all on my own is, well, they franchise tagged Josh Allen, you know, edge rusher who came out in the same class as Nick Bosa. Well, if they franchise tagged him and they have no indication of giving him a contract extension and they want to keep their first round draft pick, could you do Josh Allen for Brandon Aiyuk straight up? And then obviously the 49ers would pay Josh Allen at edge, and then they get Aiyuk, they pay Aiyuk, and they go out and they draft Chop Robinson. They go out, get Jared Verse, Florida State kid at 17. So now I'm spinning. Now I'm like, this lady just dropped nugget after nugget and basically goes on to say that, yes, they will pay Brandon. If that's what he wants, we know that Calvin Ridley deal has a direct impact on Brandon Aiyuk's deal. And she's basically saying, yeah, Baalke will pay that. He was going to pay it to Ridley. Now he gets a player that's 4 years younger and in the peak of his prime. Again, none of this means that Brandon Aiyuk is going to get traded. I think part of this is like, this is what happens a lot. Like, we don't know about this stuff. Like, this is why this insight is crazy. We don't know about that. We don't hear about this stuff. It's so rare that we get that type of information like that. And she was spitballed, like boom, 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 nugget, nugget, nugget. I was like, oh, Dr. Phil meme, like, oh, whoa, chill. It's almost too much information. So, again, the point that I'm making is I guarantee these conversations happen all the time. Wouldn't be surprised if that's similarly kind of like how the conversation happened with DeForest Buckner. It's like, well, if someone is willing to pay you, go find that person. And if we can work out the compensation on the back end, then maybe we can work something out. I'm of the belief that the 49ers want to pay Brandon Aiyuk. And again, I think one of the important things that she also clarifies is that none of this has come from the 49ers side. Nothing. Like, it takes 3 to tango in trade for the most part. Not always, but I think in this scenario, when you're looking for a contract extension, it takes 3 to tango. You need the player to agree to the contract. You need the trading team to agree to the contract in which they're paying and the compensation. And then, of course, the team that's trading Brandon away, which would be the 49ers, need to agree to trade him. So you need all 3. She's only talked about the 2. She only talked about Brandon Aiyuk and the Jags. And she comes from the Jags. She's clearly directly connected with the Jags. So this is fascinating. A lot of people wanted to just chalk this up to just, oh, this clout demon. Oh, just another clout demon out here trying to get clout by commenting underneath someone else's tweet. Oh, just trying to stir it up. If you've listened to Mia, that doesn't sound like clout. That sounds like she's sitting on a gold mine of information about this situation. And from a Jags perspective, she has no ties to the 49ers. She doesn't care less about the San Francisco 49ers. She lives on the other side of the country. She doesn't care about the 49ers. Her interests are the Jags. Her interests are in Florida. And all that information that she just presented makes you think in the sense of, I get it. For me, at least, I could totally understand why a rep would want to try to up the leverage, up the price. Yesterday's price is not today's price. Totally get it. Makes perfect sense to me. The problem with that is that if that gets enough like momentum, I think that's how you lose people. I think that's how trades occur, is like a fracture happens potentially. And then it gets messy. And then we're like, all right, just go work out the deal. We'll work out the compensation and we move on. Now, I hope that's not the case. I personally want Brandon Aiyuk here to stay. I want Brandon Aiyuk to get paid by the San Francisco 49ers. But this is just fascinating to me. This is a fascinating situation that all spawned off of this tweet. So again, it is very rare that I take out a notebook and I start jotting down all the points. Well, we do reaction videos all the time. That's literally what we do here. There's a lot to react to here. There's a lot to react to. And if you're asking me to, I would say, vet her as a credible source, oh, she's vetted. She is a credible source. Now it's up to you to decide and discern. Are you going to pass her along as a credible source? That's up to you, ultimately. But I based on, off a tweet, we have no idea. But I just listened to her speak on Brandon Aiyuk for about 8 to 9 minutes. And she talks so fast and drops so much information. That was one of the more insightful interviews I think I've ever heard about a situation like this. Now, again, just like she says, it's early and we know things change in a heartbeat. So that doesn't mean Brandon Aiyuk's getting traded. It doesn't mean anything happens. We could very well be looking back at this and being like, ha ha ha, Baalke wanted Brandon Aiyuk. He thought, nope, you're not getting Brandon Aiyuk. Not happening. That could very well be the outcome in a couple months from now. But again, it's very important to note that these ongoing situations, this isn't irregular. This is very normal. And we've got a rare kind of behind the curtain from another team's perspective. Typically, when I hear information, it's from friends, family, sometimes directly from the player, sometimes from the agent, sometimes someone connected to the agent, sometimes people who connected to the 49ers. I haven't heard information like this openly spoken about on airwaves. To that, I mean, confirming Trent Baalke is calling on wide receivers, confirming that someone has reached out to the Jags about interest in Aiyuk, confirming the Jags reciprocated interest in Aiyuk, tying together the representation aspect of it. Interesting. So all I'm going to say, interesting. Did we find out information that is going to change anything right now? No, not necessarily. But again, it's a peek behind the curtain from the opposite side that we don't typically hear from. So I'm curious to think or hear what you guys have to think about this. It's very interesting to me. So let me know what you think. Fact or cap? Is there mutual interest? Could the Jags be trying to angle for Brandon Aiyuk? Could Athletes First be angling to build Brandon Aiyuk's leverage in these contract negotiations by reaching out to other teams, engaging their interests? How much would they pay? Would they trade? Fascinating stuff. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comments below. And as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more updates.